In the spring of 1946, a small American town was held hostage by fear. Over the course of 10 weeks, an unknown attacker struck 5 times in and around Texarkana, a city that straddles the border of Texas and Arkansas. 8 people were attacked, 5 of them died. Every single attack happened at night, outdoors, in the dark. And then it stopped, completely, without explanation. The attacker was never identified, never arrested, never heard from again. The case was never solved. 78 years later, it remains one of the most chilling unsolved serial killer cases in American history. The town and the time. To understand the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, you need to understand the world in which they happened. It was 1946. The Second World War had just ended. American soldiers were coming home in enormous numbers. Towns were readjusting to peacetime life, and across the country there was a collective exhale, a sense that the worst was behind everyone and that normal life could resume. Texarkana was a modest town of around 44,000 people split directly down the middle by the Texas-Arkansas state line. State Street ran through the center of the city with Texas on one side and Arkansas on the other. This geographical quirk would later create genuine jurisdictional complications for the investigation. It was a tight-knit community. People knew each other, they felt safe, they had no reason not to. That changed on February 22, 1946. The first attack. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were a young couple who had parked their car on a lonely road on the outskirts of town late at night. A man approached their vehicle wearing a white mask with holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. He was carrying a gun. He forced both of them out of the car and attacked them with extraordinary violence. Jimmy Hollis was beaten severely and suffered a fractured skull. Mary Jean Larry was assaulted and beaten. Both survived, though their injuries were serious. They described their attacker as a tall white man, powerfully built, wearing that distinctive homemade mask. He said very little. He was methodical and controlled. Police took their report. The investigation began, and for a brief period, investigators hoped this was an isolated incident. It was not. On March 24, 1946, exactly 1 month after the first attack, Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found dead in their car on a remote road outside town. Both had been shot. Both showed signs of having been attacked before being killed. They had been parked at night in a secluded location. The pattern was immediately obvious to investigators. Couples, night, isolated roads, a masked attacker. 3 weeks later, on April 14th, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were attacked after leaving a dance. Paul was found shot dead on a road. Betty Jo's body was discovered over a mile away in the woods, having been moved after her death. She was 15 years old. The town responded the way any community responds when it realizes a predator is operating in its midst. People stopped going out at night. Gun sales increased dramatically. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes after dark. Drive-in theaters and dance halls emptied out. The streets of Texarkana after sunset became completely deserted. Local police, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI all joined the investigation. Given that the attacks were happening near the state line, jurisdictional questions complicated coordination between law enforcement agencies. Investigators were working together, but working across bureaucratic lines that slowed everything down. The killer struck again before they could find him. The final attack and a shift in pattern. On May 3, 1946, Virgil and Katie Starks were attacked at their farmhouse several miles outside town. This attack was different from all the previous ones in a significant way. The Starks were not a young couple parked on a remote road at night. They were a middle-aged married couple inside their own home. Virgil Starks was shot through a window while sitting in his living room reading a newspaper. He died at the scene. His wife Katie was shot twice in the face but survived. She managed to flee the house on foot to a neighbor's property and raise the alarm. The attacker had been standing outside the window in the dark, shooting through the glass. He entered the house after the shooting. He left when he heard Katie escaping. This change in victim profile alarmed investigators significantly. If the killer was no longer restricting himself to couples in parked cars, nobody in Texarkana was safe. The fear that had already gripped the town intensified into something closer to collective panic. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The silence. After the attack on the Starks farmhouse, the Phantom, as local newspapers had taken to calling the attacker, simply disappeared. No more attacks, no more victims, no communication of any kind. Complete silence. Over the years, several suspects have been named publicly by researchers and investigators. The most prominent was a man named Ewell Swinney, whose wife gave statements to investigators claiming he had confessed to the murders. Swinney was eventually imprisoned on an unrelated charge of car theft. His wife later recanted her statements. He was never charged with the Texarkana murders and maintained his innocence until his death. Other suspects have been raised and dismissed over the decades. None has produced the kind of evidence necessary for a conclusion. The case remains officially open. Why this case still matters? The Texarkana Moonlight Murders occupy a specific and important place in the history of American crime for several reasons beyond the obvious horror of what happened. They represent one of the earliest cases in which modern serial killer investigation techniques were genuinely needed but did not yet fully exist. The concept of criminal profiling was in its infancy in 1946. The idea of a coordinated multi-agency task force with shared intelligence systems was decades away. Investigators were working with the tools of an earlier era against a type of criminal that those tools were not designed to catch. The case also had a measurable and documented impact on the daily life of an entire community. The behavioral changes in Texarkana during those 10 weeks, the empty streets, the locked doors, the armed residents, the businesses that closed at dusk, represent something remarkable. A single unknown individual effectively shut down a city of 44,000 people through fear alone. The Phantom was also one of the first cases to receive what we would today recognize as mass media saturation. Newspapers across the country covered the attacks in real time. The story spread far beyond Texarkana and made national audiences genuinely afraid in a way that peacetime America in 1946 was entirely unprepared for. And finally, the case matters because it was never solved. Not because investigators stopped trying, but because the trail genuinely went cold. The attacker left remarkably little physical evidence. Forensic science in 1946 could not do what it can do today. And whoever the Phantom of Texarkana was, he was careful, controlled, and ultimately successful in disappearing. 10 weeks. 5 crime scenes, 8 victims, 5 dead. 1 masked attacker who was never caught, never identified, and never heard from again. Texarkana never fully recovered its sense of safety after those 10 weeks in 1946. Some towns are defined by what they built. Texarkana is partly defined by what came out of the dark and was never explained. The case is still open. The identity of the Phantom is still unknown. Subscribe for more cases like this one. Tell me in the comments, who do you think the Phantom really was?